All righty. Welcome everyone to the March Connectivity Working Group. I know it's been a couple months since we've had one. Was dealing with some cancellations of presenters and everything. So happy to have a great presenter today and get back to normal. We have several presenters dialed in for April as well. So we should hopefully be back on the regular now. Can I get someone to please read the antitrust statement? Daniela, do you mind?
Yeah, sure. The Advanced Water Heating Initiative is a member-supported collaborative of professionals from across the U.S. This diverse membership includes numerous competitors, and care must be taken to scrupulously abide by federal and state antitrust laws. Members should remember that antitrust compliance is important at all times. At this and other AWI meetings, participants should not discuss competitive pricing, profitability, allocating markets or customers, or promotion of a particular product or accessory.
Many thanks. So for our agenda today, we're just going to go through a couple HPWHs updates, and then we'll hear from Daniela on a connected heat pump water heater study in North Carolina focused on low-income homes. So super excited about that, and we'll save a bunch of time for Q&A as well, as I'm sure there will be. We've had Daniela on this working group before. However, the study has concluded, the report is out, and there are a whole bunch of exciting updates. So definitely excited for this one. And then we'll end with some Q&A and closing. And if anyone has not been on this particular call before, I'd love for you to come off camera and briefly introduce yourself and where you work. Alrighty, no newcomers, but all good. So recently we just had the all stakeholders meeting. In fact, it was just yesterday, and it's kind of our big tent meeting. If you missed it, the recording should be on YouTube soon. We had some great presentations on a variety of residential and commercial heat pump water heater technologies. So definitely cool stuff, including some thermal storage, which is definitely relevant to this group. The heat pump water heater state of the market report is also out. It kind of includes some history of heat pump water heaters and some of the current products available on the market, both for, again, residential and commercial, looking at both. And then we kind of look at some trends for the heat pump water heater market as well. So if you want to check that out, you can click the link here. You can also just go to Advanced Water Heating Initiative/resources, and you'll be able to find the report there. And lastly, on the news front here, we got some, I think it's AHRI data from 2024. So now of the most recent electric versus gas sales data. Note that heat pump water heaters are included in the electric storage tank metric there. They don't bifurcate them. But we can see overall the electric market is really gaining on gas. If you look at the graph at the top, or the line chart, you can see that you can see the gap widening, and then if you want to see the exact gap numbers, you can look at the bar chart on the bottom. So we see that it's 880,000 more electric resistance or heat pump water heater total sales than gas in 2024. So really kind of seeing that gap widen there, which is exciting news for decarbonization as well as load shifting potential. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Daniela, and I'll stop sharing here.
All right,
Great, thanks.
Can I share my presentation? Okay, there's a little bit of an echo, but I think it's gone now. Noah, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me well? Great.
And I can see your slides, so it looks good.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, hi everyone. My name is Daniela Urigwe. I'm an engineer at Energy Solutions. Today, I'm going to talk about a connected heat pump water heater load shifting study that we conducted in North Carolina with support from the Pacific Northwest National Lab and funding from the U.S. Department of Energy. And I presented this study at an AWI connectivity meeting about a year ago, but at that point, the study was only about halfway done. And it was completed mid last year. So today I'll be sharing an update with final results from this study. And because we had a little more time today, I was able to add some tidbits that have not been shared elsewhere. So, you all will hear it first. Um, Moving on to the next slide. So first I'm going to discuss some of the background on this project. So this project builds on some prior work completed by PNNL, which included a 2017 to 2018 large-scale connected heat pump water heater study with BPA, Portland General Electric, and NEA, as well as a more recent effort in 2020 to 2022 with the Florida Solar Energy Center. And that study, that included a field study as well as lab testing of connected heat pump water heaters. And those prior studies looked at the load impact of heat pump water heater load shifting, as well as the impact of different load shifting strategies on energy demand. And so building on that, this study was conceptualized by a colleague of mine in conjunction with the North Carolina Justice Center. And for this study, we wanted to explore the energy saving and load shifting potential for heat pump water heaters installed in low income or hard to reach households in North Carolina. Since that demographic had not been targeted for many of the prior heat pump water heater load shifting studies, even though cost savings are particularly important for them given the high energy burden low income households face. So the project was funded by USDOE with in-kind contributions of time and resources from PNNL, and we were able to leverage the outcomes of PNNL's prior studies with some of the analytical tools that they had developed as well for this study. And they also provided the water heater control modules. And some of the other key contributors include the North Carolina Justice Center and Rebuilding Together the Triangle, which is the local chapter of the national nonprofit Rebuilding Together, which helps provide home repair services to people in need, for example, to allow them to age in place in their homes. And that RTT, they're called Rebuilding Together Triangle RTT, they install the heat pump water heaters at participant homes free of charge, along with some other home retrofits and upgrades. So in terms of region, we wanted to do this study in the Southeast in particular because it's an ideal region to apply some of the lessons learned from those prior studies. In North Carolina, 73% of homes use electric resistance water heaters, making it the state with the third highest penetration of electric water heating and the state with the third largest fleet of electric water heaters. And transitioning North Carolina's standard electric resistance water heaters to heat pump water heaters could result in significant energy savings. North Carolina is also experiencing a strong growth in their annual peak electricity demand. And so they could benefit from appliance load flexibility to help reduce that system peak and to help accommodate their growing solar resource as well. All right, so that was the background. Now I'm going to talk about some of the key facts of the study and some of the information about the participants in this study. So this project had three main goals. The first one was to document the energy savings and to see how the heat pump water heater load shifting can reduce costs for low income customers that are on time varying rates. In this case, it was a time of use rate schedule. And I should say there isn't a paper from last year's ACEEE summer study that has all of the details of this study. So it has a little bit more information about the energy savings. So we did look at actually the savings from going.
One of the distributors, aren't you?
Please stay on
I'm
mute.
actually a builder. Oh, you're actually the builder. Okay.
Yeah, there's some background noise. If you could mute yourself. Okay. So I was saying that in the paper we looked at the savings from going from a standard electric water heater to a heat pump water heater, as well as the savings from the load shifting. But this presentation is going to focus on the load shifting. So the next thing we wanted to document was the operation of connected load shifting heat pump water heaters for the North Carolina climate zone, which experiences both hot summers and also relatively cold winters, and where people sometimes do have their water heaters installed outside and in unconditioned spaces, which would be pretty rare in some of the colder climates. And we wanted to document the water heating load profiles of our study demographic, which was a little bit unique, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And then finally, as these load shifting programs get more popular, for heat pump water heaters in particular, we wanted to share lessons we learned for implementing heat pump water heater load shifting programs in low income communities or with hard to reach customers. And listed here are some of the key facts about this project. So Rebuilding Together the Triangle, or RTT, installed 24, well, they completed installations of 24 hybrid 240 volt heat pump water heaters with eco ports in single family low income households in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina. There were actually more potential participants in this study, but some of them were filtered out for various reasons. The water heaters were controlled for about 1 year using CTA 2045 cellular universal communication modules, as well as CTA 2045 messaging. There were 2 heat pump water heater brands included in this study, and since the water heaters were installed by RTT, free of charge to the participants, we didn't have control over, actually what size water heater was installed and settings like the water heater mode. That was left up to the household, to set up as they wanted to. And another important note here is that the households did not have mixing valves to allow their water heaters to store water at a higher temperature without the risk of scalding. So we were limited to basic preheating for load shifting rather than the sort of more advanced load up or higher temperature preheating that we might have been able to do otherwise. And finally, the participants were paid for their participation. They received a payment at the start of the study and then at the end of the study, and they had to complete about, I think, 3 short surveys to be eligible to receive the payments. And so this slide summarizes some information about the participant homes and equipment. So there was a range of home ages. Most homes were about 50 years old, with an average size of around 1,300 square feet. The water heater location of installation varied a little bit. So most of them were installed in conditioned or semi-conditioned spaces within the home's envelope. But there were about 4 water heaters that were installed in unconditioned spaces outside. So that's, maybe it was, I think, a shed or like an unconditioned detached space. So we did see that in a few cases. About half of the participants had gas water heaters before the retrofit. And that was a little bit of a higher percentage than we expected, given the high penetration of electric water heating in North Carolina. But the rest had electric water heaters. And the water heaters were installed between May 2021 and May 2023. So, and this study ran from about July 2023 to July 2024. So some participants were already comfortable with their heat pump water heaters, and some were new to the technology when we started the study. So it was a mix of experiences with that product. And then all but one of the water heaters were 50-gallon tanks, and there was one 80-gallon tank. We didn't make the decision about the size of the tanks. That was something that the partner RTT decided on. So, even though the participant households kind of range in size, they all mostly had the same size water heater. And a little bit more about the participants. About 80% of the households in the study were below 50% of the area median income. And most of the participant homes were comprised of older adults and seniors, actually. So 5 homes also had children or teens, but it was, predominantly adults and seniors. And most homes only had 1 to 2 occupants per household, but a couple households had 5 to 6 occupants at the start of the study. And this is the information that was reported at the start of the study, but as I mentioned, we did a couple surveys throughout the course of the study. And also, we were in contact with these participants over the course of the study. And one of the things that we found was that household occupancy changes were common over the course of the study due to factors like family members moving in and out, occupants moving out due to health challenges. And so there was kind of a large fluctuation in that for some households. For example, we had a household that started as one person with the water heater size for one person, but over the course of the study, they had five other family members move in, and it became a six-person household. And they ended up having a lot of issues with hot water, as you might expect. And eventually, they were removed from the study due to the water heater being undersized for the eventual number of the occupants in the home. Oh, I see some chats coming in, and I think my colleague Helen is responding to this. That's great. Okay, next slide. And then a little bit more about the participant recruiting. So these participants were not your typical early adopters of this technology. So there were some challenges on the recruiting side, although there were also some good highlights that we had. So on the positive side, we know that trust is a major factor in getting people on board with a program or technology that they're unfamiliar with. And since our participants were RTT clients that trusted RTT, it made the referral process much easier than if we had been trying to reach out to these households with cold outreach. Additionally, many participants reported noticeable bill savings from the switch to heat pump water heaters. So they were happy with the product and open to the load shifting study before it even started. Some of the challenges included the fact that many of the participants didn't have email or home Wi-Fi, so interaction with them required phone calls, or for the surveys it required physical mail, and that is more time-consuming typically than doing it online. And given that the study participants were mostly seniors, some of the participants didn't have the mobility to be able to reach or see or plug in a communication module, or to be able to see a user interface that's located at the top of the water heater. And that made troubleshooting difficult in some instances where they would be required to, look at the module or see the interface to be able to answer questions. So, they were sometimes able to have a child or another family member in the household help out on the phone to troubleshoot. And finally, for customers that did have Wi-Fi, sometimes they did not trust the online interaction. So for example, we tried to get customers to sign up on the manufacturer cloud app to provide another method of monitoring their data, but only 3 of our 24 participants actually successfully did that. And it was a range of, just not being comfortable with the app or Wi-Fi, or not wanting to share their, information with an app, or all sorts of things. So that was an interesting finding that we saw. So now I'm going to move into the results section. And as mentioned before, a main goal of this study was to demonstrate how the demand management features of these connected water heaters can unlock additional benefits for low to moderate income customers and the grid, especially in the Southeast US. And this is in addition to those energy efficiency savings that customers get from a heat pump water heater. So first, I'm going to talk about how we designed the load shifting aspect of the study to achieve that goal. And then I'm going to talk about some of the lessons we learned. So for participants to save money by load shifting, they have to have access to an electricity rate that incentivizes that behavior, such as a time of use rate, where electricity is cheaper off-peak compared to higher prices during a peak period, for example. So the first thing we looked at when designing the load shifting study were the regional time of use rates available to the study participants, with a goal of developing a load shifting schedule that would shift energy use to off-peak periods that are cheaper for customers. And over 60% of our study households were Duke Energy customers, and they were pretty evenly split between Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas customers. So the utility territory that we are working with is in the highlighted box in the image on the right of this slide. And at the time the study was designed, most of our participants did have access to a time of use rate. But for the purposes of this study, we didn't ask participants to change their rate schedule, and we allowed them to just be on whatever schedule they were on. And that's because we were only controlling the water heater and not the other appliances in the homes that they might not have that might not be flexible. And so when we did the calculations of the cost impacts using the TOU rates, we only looked at the water heater operation as if they had been on a time of use rate and didn't actually, change the rate and look at actual bill impacts. So this slide shows more detail on the Duke Energy time of use rates we use as a starting point for choosing the load shifting periods in this study. This table shows the various rates that were available when the study was designed, which was in early 2023. And the top table has the winter period rates, and the bottom table has the summer period rates. The peak periods are in red, the shoulder periods are in pink, and the off-peak periods are in white. And since we designed this study a couple of years ago, the rate schedules have changed. So most of these are no longer offered, and there are new rates that have that are available now, and those actually look better for load shifting. So I'll touch on that later. But this is what we were working with when we designed the study. And as you can see, the peak periods in red differ a little bit across those rate options. So the most basic time of use rate that would have been applicable to our participants was the TOU 79. That's the second row in both of these tables. And that rate included a long peak and shoulder period that totaled about 9 hours a day in the winter and summer. And 9 hours is a long time. It's challenging to reduce load for that amount of time. The water heater, because you have to hold off heating water for a long time. Most of the systems are going to have to recover at some point in that time period. But that was what we were working with for this study. And, but as I mentioned earlier, the majority of the participants in this study were seniors with only 1 to 2 participants per household. So because of their overall small and infrequent water usage, they actually tended to be a bit more flexible in their water heating usage compared to other demographics, which is a really interesting finding. They just didn't have to heat water that often. They didn't use that much hot water. So that actually made this demographic pretty well suited to defer their water heating for a long period of time in alignment with these long peak periods. So that said, based on these rate schedules, we chose to schedule the participant load reductions from 6 a.m. to 12 p.m. and 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. In the winter, and 1 to 9 p.m. in the summer to capture those peak periods. And those are the peak periods that are going to be most likely for the participants if they were to choose a utility time of use rate. I just want to look at the chat real quick, make sure that there's nothing.
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah, I think most of the questions have been answered by myself or Helen. I was curious, though, how extreme the price differences were during the peak and off-peak hours, because I feel like that's
Yeah.
always key in incentivizing folks to actually switch their operation.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's more detail on this in the report, but I think there was like one rate that had a super or discount period. I didn't actually put the discount periods on this slide, but some of these also had discount periods, and those were as low as like
Mm.
5 or 6 cents a
Oh,
kilowatt hour,
wow. Yeah.
which is really cheap. And then the off peak was usually around 9 cents a kilowatt hour, and then the peak was usually around 25 cents a kilowatt hour.
Oh, that's a
So
big difference. Okay, wow. Yeah,
mm,
factor of 3 or so. Impressive.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
always rough and it's like, yeah, peak is 30 cents and off peak is 22 cents or whatever. It's like,
yeah.
am I really gonna do that much? But sweet. Well, continue on there. Just wanted to get that clarification and yeah, awesome stuff so far.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so these are the load shifting schedules and the demand management messages that we use in this study. And so to design these schedules, as mentioned, we first looked at those TOU rates and we looked at the peak and off-peak periods. So generally the peak periods are when we're going to be shedding, and the off-peak periods, or before the peak period is when we're going to be heating the water. Um, And then in addition to the Duke Energy time of use rates, we also considered seasonal differences and results from the prior P&L work. So even though the rates from the Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas um, define summer and winter seasons a little bit differently, we actually decided to use the same summer and winter season definition for all of our participants, regardless of their utility, to keep everyone on the same load shifting schedule and collect more robust data. So we defined the summer season as May through September and the winter season as October through April based on those rate schedules. And then we further split the winter and summer into a shoulder and a hot and cold season to be able to further differentiate our results by ambient temperature. Because, the early part of the winter and then the coldest part of the winter just had sort of different results. And then the load shifting plan also drew on findings from prior P&L heat pump water heater load shifting studies. So that informed the amount of time we were doing the load ups, some of the strategies for different weather conditions, and then the demand management signals that we use to optimize load shifting. And we synthesized all of these factors to create the load shifting the load shifting schedules used in the study, which are shown here. So we used 3 demand management signals. Many of you are likely familiar with these. This included load up, which is shown in blue on this chart. That generally means increase energy use by heating water to the set point. As I mentioned before, we didn't do an advanced load up because we didn't have mixing valves for these customers. We used the shed signal, generally meaning to stop heating water unless there's a risk of cold water. For example, by reducing the set point to a lower value, and the shed is shown in light purple. And then we used a critical peak signal, meaning to reduce demand more aggressively than the normal shed, for example, by going to a lower set point value. And that is shown in dark purple. In the warmer months, we use the shorter load up period of just an hour. In the colder months, we use a longer load-up period to allow more time for the heat pump to heat the tank with colder ambient and colder inlet water temperatures. And in the coldest months, the cold winter, we only use the shed and we didn't use the critical peak signal because we wanted to make sure the water heaters could adequately recover given the colder temperatures. For the rest of the months, we used both critical peak and shed signals. We were targeting the critical peak at the times where we wanted to test deeper sheds or the most important times of the day, and then use shed in some of the other peak hours where, a little bit of recovery was fine. And for the duration of the study, we did load shifting about 75% of the time, and the rest of the time, the water heaters operated without load shifting to collect baseline data. So we sort of switched on and off between load shifting weeks and non-load shifting weeks. Okay, so finally, going to go over some of the results we saw in this study. So this slide shows the load shifting performance by season. There was, and this is kilowatt hours, so the total amount of energy shifted over that window shown in the shed period. And there were some obvious trends seen, like the colder it was, the more the baseline energy use was. And, again, I'll note here that in the summer, we only did an evening load shift, but in the winter, there was both a morning and an evening load shift. And that's because the high penetration of electric heating in North Carolina in winter, there is a morning peak, and that's a very important time period for load shifting in that region. So we did do a morning shift in the winter. So even given those long load reduction periods that I talked about, we found that participants successfully shifted their energy consumption out of the peak period. They were, in general, able to shift around 30 to 45% of their water heater energy use in the morning and 25 to 50% of their use in the evening, depending on the season. So the charts on the right show both the baseline non-load shifting energy consumption. So that's the kind of larger bars in the lighter color. And then the amount of energy shifted is the smaller bar in the darker color. So the difference between the light bar and the dark bar is that remaining energy consumption on average. So there was a significant amount of load shifted. There was also, interestingly, a minor decrease in the average total daily energy consumption of about 5 to 10% due to the load shifting schedule, but this effect was modest and it wasn't a goal for this study. It's just something that we saw.
Quick question, Daniela. On the percent of non-shifting baseline, does that mean total household load? That's, everything, including heat pump water heaters?
No, it's just the water heater load. So it's just the water heater load without load shifting. And then the other bar is just the water heater load with the load shifting.
Understood. Okay, just trying to clarify there because you were saying it was like 30-ish%, and I'm seeing smaller numbers here. So just want to clarify.
Yeah, it's 30. So the load shift, like it ranges by season. It's highest, the evening I think was a little bit more, but we were able to shift about 30% of the water heating load, or 30 to 50% depending on the season.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah. And so this slide goes a little deeper into this effect, looking at the same results but broken down by occupancy. And so this is broken down on if the home had 1, 2, or 3 or more occupants. The majority of households only had 1 occupant. And, as you might expect, large households with higher usage, they had more water heating energy use, and therefore they could shift more energy in the study. But both the low and the high occupancy households were able to shift a similar percentage of their baseline water heating energy use without load shifting. And in terms of the cost savings, as I mentioned earlier, the electricity rates in this region are pretty low. The off-peak rate was about 9 cents per kilowatt hour. So the cost savings is lower than it would be in a region with higher rates. But overall, we estimated that the load shifting would have an annual additional water heater cost savings of about $45 just from shifting load. And then when we looked at the energy consumption from switching to the heat pump water heater for the prior water heater, that was an annual savings of around, like $110 or something. So this is about a 40% additional cost savings for these customers on top of the savings that they're getting from the efficiency increase, which is notable, especially for the low income households. And just looking at some of the questions coming in, I hope that this could be answered. But yeah, so about 40% additional cost savings from just the load shifting portion of the study on top of the savings from the water heater efficiency. So up next, I am going to talk about some of the load shifting results in terms of daily customer demand. The demand profiles show that the participant water heaters did respond to the water heating demand management signals as expected. There were minor load increases compared to the baseline for the load up periods. Here, those are shown in blue on the charts. And so you can see, because we didn't do the advanced load up, those increases are pretty minor. And then there were load reductions compared to the baseline for the critical peak and shed periods. So in these charts, the dotted line is the baseline water heater energy use, or the demand, without load shifting, and then the purple line with the circles is the demand with the load shifting. So, the average demand reduction range from 40 watts in the summer when there wasn't a lot of baseline load at all, to maybe 80 watts in the winter when there was more load to shed. So we were basically able to defer most of the heating loads to outside of the peak period. And the water heater would recover after the shed period. But in general, that recovery was in the range of the heat pump compressor power. So it was about 250 watts on average. The increase was about 250 watts on average, rather than being dominated by the electric resistance element operation. So that was a good finding. And due to the prevalence of low occupancy, low usage households in this study, baseline water heater energy use for this population was generally quite low. but the participant water heaters did reliably shift their load out of the peak periods while still providing participants with sufficient hot water to meet their daily needs. We had very few complaints about hot water in the study. The complaints we did have were for households that had a lot of occupants. But outside of that, for the majority of the households, there were no issues with the load shifting. So even with shifting all of this load out of the peak period, we didn't really see a negative customer impact, which was good. One other aspect we wanted to look at was the prevalence of the operation of electric resistance elements. So as mentioned before, these were all hybrid 240 volt heat pump water heaters with electric resistance backup elements. And we didn't control the mode the water heater operated in. That was up to the participant. So they generally tended to operate their water heaters in hybrid mode, which can use the electric elements if needed in addition to the heat pump. So in this slide, we're looking at the average demand during the peak periods. Those peak periods align with our shed periods, as well as how often the electric resistance elements were operating during those periods, both for the non-load shifting baseline and then the load shifting time periods. So in the chart on the left, the total average peak period demand is the total height of the bars. And then the average demand while load shifting is the dark portion of the bars. So that upper lighter portion of the bars is the average peak period demand reduction that we saw due to load shifting. And as I mentioned before, the largest reduction was seen in the coldest part of the winter because that's when there was the most energy use. And the table on the right shows the incidence of peak period electric resistance element usage with and without load shifting. For these participants, the electric resistance element usage was pretty low before load shifting, ranging from about 3 to 5% of the time, depending on the season. But the load shifting reduced the incidence of that on-peak electric resistance element usage by 30 to 60%, depending on the season, down to a range of about 1.5 to 2%. And this is interesting because, with these hybrid units, even though they are very efficient when using the heat pump, when they are using those elements, there is a higher electricity use. So we wanted to look at, the incidence of that specific type of operation on peak and the effect of the load shifting on that. And looking a little bit more deeply into that hour after the load shift window, this slide shows the similar stats, but for that 1 hour immediately following the load shift window. So this slide is on the same scale as the prior slide. So you can see that there was a big jump in demand in that 1 hour after the shed, up to about 350 to 400 watts. The total bar on the chart is the total average demand in that post-shift window. The dark orange on the bottom is that average demand on those baseline days when we're not load shifting, and the light orange on the top is the average increase in demand due to load shifting. So the table on the right, again, looks at the electric element usage in that hour after the load shift window. So again, the baseline without load shifting, it's around 4% of the time when the electric resistance elements are operating in that hour. But when we were load shifting, we saw that jump up to around 11, 12%, of the time. So that's still by no means near a large portion of the time for a sample. It's not like most of the water heaters were going into electric resistance operation after the shift window, but there was a little bit of an increase. And so that would be something to be aware of and potentially to control for in load shifting programs. And this last slide is just sort of a more detailed look at this. It was a little interesting when you look at the actual participants. So looking at all of our participants, this table shows the percentage of time the electric resistance element is operating during the peak window when we're load shifting, broken down by season. And the first column is the amount of operation during those non-load shifting baseline days, and the second column is the amount of operation on load shifting days. And this table is sorted by most to least electric resistance element usage and it emits about 4 participants where we didn't have any electric resistance element usage as far as we could see. So what we see is that the top 3 rows are customers that had significant electric element usage, 30 to 50% of the time in some seasons without the load shifting. These all ended up being homes with high occupancy. So the first 2 homes had 5 or 6 occupants at the start of the study. And the third home is the home that started with the 1 occupant but ended up with 6 by the end of the study due to people moving in, family members moving in. So occupancy and water occupancy is obviously a huge driver of energy use, and especially when that heat pump water heater is undersized for the amount of occupants in the home. This is a good reason to upsize the water heaters where possible.
Yeah, this is awesome. That was a huge reduction in ER usage, especially seeing like 29% to 6%. Like that's a huge impact.
Yeah. That was something interesting to see. You know, we were really able to reduce that impact, which was good. So finally, in addition to the daily load shifting, we did conduct 1 test demand response event, and that was scheduled to coincide with one of the coldest winter days in the study that simulated a grid peak day. And we wanted to demonstrate the ability of the water heaters to reduce load in support of the grid during the North Carolina system peak period. This was one of the more important goals for the region because that regional, winter peak is challenging to manage. So we conducted a test demand response event from 6 to 9 a.m. on January 17, 2024, and it was about 20 degrees Fahrenheit during that event. And for this demand response event, we used a 2-hour load up period followed by a 3-hour critical peak event. And that critical peak event is more aggressive than we were using during the normal winter cold period for load shifting. And so as shown on the graph here, you know, the green period is the demand response event, and the red line is the demand response day. The dashed line is the baseline days, which are, you know, the few prior cold days that week. So as shown here, the water heater successfully reduced their load to minimal operation during the event, avoiding the use of the compressors and the electric resistance elements for the duration of that DR event. And compared to a baseline of 4 similar cold non-load shifting days that week, we saw a reduction of about 72 watts per participant. So this shows that the controlled heat pump water heaters can be a valuable grid asset at scale to further contribute to annual peak load reduction, even given their low baseline energy use compared to electric resistance water heaters. So finally, as I touched on earlier, the time of use rates used in the study included some long peak periods. So the study load shifting periods were, 6 to 8 hours, which is a long time to shift load. And it can be hard to do that depending on your load profile. As we saw for the higher occupancy households, it'd probably be harder for them to do that. So in this case, those long load shifts were achievable because the study households had low occupancy and low water usage for the most part. And since this study was designed, Duke Energy has released new time of use rates with new season months. There's shorter peak periods. There's also new discount periods. And so these shorter peak periods can make load shifting easier and would be expected to increase load shifting performance by reducing the post-event rebound and making it easier for the units to recover. And then the customers would be able to save even more money by shifting to these discount periods, which have very low rates. So it would be an interesting opportunity for future customers in this region to try load shifting according to these schedules. So concluding the results discussion, knowing that residential water heating is a significant contributor to peak demand in North Carolina, through this project, we showed that we can shift a lot of that load off peak and at scale, result in notable peak load reduction that has financial benefits for households, including these low income households and low occupancy households. And this benefit would be even greater for households with more usage or in areas with higher rates. And here's my last slide. So this group is a little bit more focused on connectivity, and a lot of these recommendations are around program design. So I won't go into a ton of detail, but I'll just touch on some of them. So one of the things that we learned in this study is how to engage with some of the harder to reach customers in water heater load shifting programs. And we hope that some of these recommendations help make these programs more accessible to everyone. And for customers, education on time of use rates would help empower them to take advantage of the rates to minimize their costs. In terms of unit installation, it's a good best practice, as many of you would agree with, for households, especially households with fluctuating occupancy and multi-generational homes like we saw in our study, to upsize units to make sure that there's enough hot water to be able to provide hot water service while enabling load shifting. They could also consider, mixing valve. We didn't have that in this study, but that would be another option potentially. And for load shifting programs, one recommendation that we found was very helpful was to partner with trusted channels to reach hard to reach customers. So in our case, we partnered with Rebuilding Together the Triangle. They provided a great warm introduction, but it could be different organizations depending on the region. And programs could also target offerings based on customer demographics. For example, low hot water users like the seniors in our study might have more flexibility to shift load than other customers do. And so they could be a good participants, even though they don't have really high demand. And additionally, another key step that would be very helpful for programs is to include enrollment and support options that don't require internet access or an email address, because some demographics might not have those and might not be comfortable with using those. And along those lines, programs could use connectivity equipment that doesn't require home Wi-Fi. Home Wi-Fi is a good option for those that have it, but for those that don't, including other pathways like cellular EcoPort modules would be useful. And we used cellular EcoPort modules in this study. They worked great. We didn't have any connectivity issues. And then finally, electricity rates that are favorable to load shifting incentivize better load shifting performance. But not all customer loads are flexible. So one interesting thought would be to use some of this connected product data that comes out of these devices where it's available and high quality, and potentially apply the time of use rates only to those flexible loads so that customers could participate where they can, but not be penalized for non-flexible loads, which might be even more prevalent in low-income households. And the last recommendation is that, some of our low-income customers did run into product issues that and needed some support with that. So for that demographic specifically, they are likely to need support for both equipment and labor costs when there is a warranty claim or a reinstallation. So it would be great if programs could cover extended labor warranties, for example, to ensure that low-income customers that do have issues don't have to take on the additional burden of repair costs. So there's more more of this in our ACEEE paper. This was a little bit of a deeper dive than I've done on some other presentations, so glad to be able to share this. But if you would like to know more, definitely check out that paper. We can put a link to the chat so you can take a look. And that's all I have. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a ton, Daniela. That was awesome. Really, really great detail and depth to that. And we had a ton of questions. So I'm just going to start with a few in the chat, and then I'll let folks raise their hand and ask more. But thank you again.
Yeah.
Sweet. So with folks were asking how you knew how the heat pump water heater would respond to different commands, and Helen in the chat said you kind of figured it out as you went. But did you notice the kind of classic load up response to where it just, basically tells it to load up even if it's, below the deadband, basically, or what did you see there?
Yeah. We did see a load up response. It was relatively minor because we didn't do the advanced load up, but we did see a measurable load up.
Yep.
And then, the recovery after the shed period was another, that was the biggest impact that we saw.
Awesome. Okay, sweet. Yeah, great. And then let's see, we had some other ones. Yeah, so do you know much about the renewable energy penetration or grid mix in North Carolina? So might have answered that one
Mhm.
already.
Yeah, I don't have the stats offhand, but I do know that there's both uh, there has been a growth in solar and
Hmm.
renewable energy penetration, and that is something that is continuing. And I know that they're also having growth from other, industries coming in, data centers and that kind of thing as well. So on both sides of the picture, the grid is changing, and so there definitely is a place for demand flexibility.
Awesome. Cool, cool. And you talked about the bit of a, bounce back effect of more energy use after the load up period was ended. Did you account for how much of that was electric resistance versus how much was just the heat pump turning back on?
Yeah, we did. And that is detailed more in the report. It's mostly so the electric resistance is was mostly for those high occupancy households, really. For most of the participants, they did not go into electric resistance usage, but we did see it for those bigger households. But if you want more info on that, there's more detail in the paper.
Awesome. Thank you. And then I can answer this one. What is the difference between load up and normal operation in your study if both are using the water to heat to the user specified set point? Basically, if you have a dead band, right, of a certain temperature threshold, I'm not sure what it is. You might know, Daniela, but usually it's like, I don't know, 105 to 115-ish. And until you reach below the dead band, your compressor is not going to turn back on. But load up tells it no matter where you are in that dead band to turn on. So it's basically even if you're even if you haven't reached that minimum temperature setting, it'll turn back on. But Jeff, you might be able to speak to that better than me.
Yeah, Jeff Wicks. Thanks. I would also add that not every algorithm is the same. So all the manufacturers have different deadbands and or responses to that. So all it's really doing is like if it's inside that deadband, it requests it to go back up to its set points. But
Yep,
everyone's
and
different.
mhm.
And
And
Bob,
without load
Dr.
up,
Bass might be able to get to more of the specifics of some of the ones he's studied.
Yes, that's
yeah,
true. We do see different responses for different functions from different manufacturers.
yeah. Bob, do you have a idea of generally what what a typical deadband is?
No, there's just too much differentiation.
Wow.
How OEMs are treating that deadband and how they're changing the deadband when they change between different modes like shed and critical peak, and how they respond within that to a deadband when they're in load up, and there's a lot of variability.
Interesting. Jeff?
Yeah, I'd add that we don't want to be too prescriptive here. And I mean, I think the work that Dr. Bass is doing is phenomenal. But
I agree.
what we want is we want the smarts to be in the heater. And at the end of the day, remember, we're trying to provide hot water. So how the grid interacts with that needs to get smart about it. And they need to learn about it. But the manufacturer needs to be the one putting the smarts in the box.
Excellent point. I'm just looking at some more questions here.
Um,
Oh
I
yeah,
see a
go
question
ahead.
that I think hasn't been answered about. It appears that most of the tanks were installed inside where there are complaints of noise. That's an interesting question. So we did ask about that in our survey, and for the most part, people did not complain. I recall that there was one participant that didn't like the cold air. And not so much the noise. People didn't complain about the noise, but some of them did complain about the cold air that the units would put off. So one person had it in a spare bedroom, and they felt that it was making it too cold, and they couldn't use the bedroom as much as they wanted. So that was a complaint that we heard, but not so much about noise.
Really good to know. Tristan?
Yeah, hi everybody. Jeff, I only got the last part of what you were saying, and it sounds like Bob Bass was on as well. So what you said is, hey, let's make sure that the smarts are in the water heater. And that makes sense, but depending on what was said before, sorry, I jumped in at the last minute. I had to walk out. Um, it is nice that when you have a module like a CTA EcoPort module, that you can sort of temporarily overcome some of the issues that you see by changing what the module and the cloud provider of the module is doing. while you give feedback to the OEMs of perhaps there's some smarts that they could embed in themselves. So we've been able to do that sometimes to sort of overcome some of the nuances that we feel like the OEM could potentially do a better shed or a better load up. So just wanted to point out that that's one advantage of the module and the machine as opposed to purely the machine. Because if it's purely the machine, sometimes the OEM may not be able to update their firmware or something.
Fully agree. Yeah. I don't think we're in disagreement at all, Tristan.
Thanks for linking the paper, Daniela. And sweet. Did you notice any other questions you wanted to answer from the chat?
Just trying to read through them and see. Okay, I'm just going to start at the top. Were any of these participants in the Duke Energy Florida electric water heater program? No. Yeah, these were in North Carolina. Seeing if there's anything else.
Yeah, it looks like you hit most of it.
One last question, if I could, Danielle.
Yeah.
Great presentation, by the way. Did you use any DC modules or were they all AC modules?
They were all AC modules. Yeah, we had two different manufacturers with both AC modules.
Okay, it's just helpful. It's good feedback for the manufacturers to know which direction that study was done. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. One question, one of the issues, were there any hardware failures in the sample? Yeah, we did have a couple. So we had one where the water heater was replaced. At that was actually the customer, the participant that had the all of the people move into their home. So they had kind of an unfortunate experience where they had some issues with the water heater that was replaced, and then they still didn't have enough hot water service because they had just so many people. So that they ended up dropping out of the study by the end.
How many folks did they have in the house again?
They started with one, and I believe they ended up with 6.
Oh wow, yeah, it's too much for. I mean,
A 50-gallon heap of water.
Yeah, that's gnarly.
Yeah, so they tried all sorts of. We did a lot of troubleshooting with different modes and all sorts of things. But they had some challenges, and then there was one other hardware issue that we came across where seemed to be some kind of issue, and sort of resolved itself after several months. So we were kind of keeping an eye on it to see what was going on. But yeah, we did note a couple issues.
You know what the hourly recovery is on the 50-gallon 240 you were using?
You mean like the rating or?
Yeah, yeah, just like the how many gallons it can reheat to set point in an hour.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to look at those.
Yeah, no worries. Because it's always just a good thing to think about. But anyway, I think we're about time. But yeah, just huge thanks again, Daniela. Really, really appreciate having you on. That was great.
Yeah, of course. And if anyone has any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to me over email. My email's on the screen. This recording will be available, and always happy to answer any more questions. Yeah, thanks, Noah.
Yeah, thank you. And look forward to seeing y'all next on April 11th. We'll hear from Jeff Barnes at SDG&E, and then we'll also hear from Aquanta, who makes some heat pump, water heater, and electric resistance controls. So cool stuff next time as well. And hope to see you in a few weeks. Cheers, y'all.
Thanks. Nice presentation, Daniela.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everyone. Bye.